All right. Well, hi. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone, wherever you are in the world. We're so happy that you've joined us today to learn a little bit about language documentation. So this is our very first session of 2024. This is now our sixth year running these webinars, and we're so happy to meet some new people and see some familiar names again. And again, just a reminder, each Friday, which is 2:30 p.m. Hawaii time, this may be Saturday morning, depending on where you are, for the next 9 weeks. Each week, a different person will lead an online workshop related to language documentation or revitalization. And I think a lot of you have told me where you are calling in from, so I'd like to just acknowledge where I am speaking to you from. I am living and working as a settler on the traditional territories of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other peoples who have lived and cared for these lands, which is now where the city called Portland, Oregon still stands. And Chinook Wawa is still spoken here and is actively being revitalized. And I'll introduce myself since so many others of you have introduced yourselves. Hi, my name is Anna Belew. I am the Executive Director of the Endangered Languages Project, and I'm also an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Most of my own experience in language documentation work has been in another part of the world, in Cameroon, with speakers of Iasa and Madumba. So that's most of my own experience. And I'll just go over some technical details for this webinar before we start. So if you're worried about being able to attend the live sessions, don't worry. If you miss them, you can watch the recordings anytime after this session is over. So these will appear in the Facebook group as well as on ELP's YouTube page, and I will put those links in the chat in a moment too. You can also find the slides that I'm showing you now in the Google Drive folder for this webinar. So I will share that link with you as well. And just a housekeeping note, please, if you could, keep your microphone muted while the presentation part is happening each week. But feel free to turn on your microphone during the question and answer session if you'd like to talk or ask any questions. And if you run into any technical problems during the session, please comment in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on the chat window there and help you out if you're having any issues. One question that we often get is, will I receive a certificate for completing this webinar? And the answer is yes. Everyone who attends the live sessions will get a certificate of participation. Generally, we say try to attend 8 out of the 9 sessions on Zoom to get a certificate. But again, this is really on the honor system. So if you're not able to come to the live sessions and you just watch the videos on YouTube, that's totally okay. Just write us an email and we'll get you a certificate. And actually, one more note before we continue. I know that I have a pretty strong American accent and I often talk a little bit fast. So I'm going to try and go slower. But if ever I'm going too fast or it's hard to understand me, just say in the chat, slow down, and I will slow down or go back. All right, so this is interesting to see every year. I'd like to take a quick poll. How many languages do you think there are in the world? I'll give it a moment for some answers in the chat here. I'll just review some of your lovely greetings in the chat as well. All right, we have somebody answering 7,000. Yeah, 6,000. 8,324 at least, more than 7,000. Oh, we have a very specific 7,151, more than 7,009. Wow, this is great to see. In the early years of this webinar, some people would say like, I don't know, maybe 500. But I think 6 years later, the word has really gotten around that there are thousands and thousands of languages. And for those of you saying something in the 7,000 range, yeah, that's sort of a linguist's best guess right now. Something like 7,000, probably more than that, is the current best estimate for how many languages there might be in the world at this moment. And the thing about that language diversity is it is vast, but also most of that diversity is small groups of people speaking languages. And so most languages, again, based on the best estimates that are available, most languages are spoken by only about 4% of the global population, whereas the 4% of languages that are the biggest are spoken by about 96% of people in the world, right? And that's kind of a staggering statistic. Most languages in this world have relatively very small speaker populations. And so that diversity really thrives in small language populations. And then we come to this question of endangerment, right? I said right now there are probably about 7,000 languages, maybe more, but that number is changing over time. And this change represents something that linguists and other types of folks generally call language endangerment. And you may be thinking, endangered is a term I usually hear for like a panda or perhaps a kind of bird. And what does that mean when it comes to languages? Well, first, I want to say that the terminology of endangered language or language endangerment is problematic. There are a lot of communities that do not like to use this term, do not prefer to apply it to their own languages. And there are a lot of really legitimate issues with this terminology and this framing, and a lot of the discourses, the way we talk about language endangerment. So I'm using the term here because it's really widely used, and people from a lot of different parts of the world and a lot of different backgrounds are familiar with this term endangered. But there's a lot to unpack in how we talk about language loss. So I've added some suggested readings in the Google Drive folder, and there's also a link to a video from a past webinar session that talks about these discourses, these ways of talking about language endangerment. But that said, this term endangered means in general that a language is facing some kind of risk of not being spoken or signed anymore. And that risk could be very far in the future. It could be several generations from now, or it could be quite soon, right? If you have just a few speakers who are very elderly, that risk could be very soon. And this is not hypothetical. This is not just something people predict might happen. It's something that is happening and has happened consistently for the past couple of centuries. This is actually the worst time in all of known human history for language endangerment. There are currently more languages being silenced than ever before. And just in the last 60 years or so, there are hundreds and hundreds of languages that have been silenced. So this is not theoretical at all. This is not abstract. This is a real thing happening to real communities all the time. And if we look at some sort of statistics around this, I know a lot of people are very comfortable with numbers. It's a stark number. Almost half of all of the world's languages are currently endangered. About 46% of them, probably more by our best estimates. And this is from ELP's Catalog of Endangered Languages, which is sort of the research side run out of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So I guess a question a lot of people ask when they hear that almost half of all the languages in the world are endangered is why? What's going on? What's happening? And why are languages being silenced? And I will say right up front, there is no simple answer. Language endangerment is an incredibly complex set of things that happens to language communities. But let's start with something really basic. Number one, it has nothing to do with the language itself or with the languages, right? And this was known by linguists decades ago. Back in 1948, an early linguist named Morris Swadesh said, the factors determining obsolescence of language, or what we would today call language endangerment, are non-linguistic. What does that mean? That's not the simplest way to put it. Basically, let's unpack it. It means languages do not become endangered because they're too complicated or conversely too simple, right? If you look at it like a linguist would, all languages are incredibly complex and they all have the functions they need for people to communicate with each other, right? So all languages have different types of complicated features, and there's no such thing as a language that's too complicated for a baby to learn. Any human baby can learn any human language. And that's why this next thing, too hard to learn, doesn't really make sense either, right? For generations and generations and generations, people have learned these languages just by listening to the people around them. It's not like you have to go to a class to learn a language. Learning language is something that humans naturally do. So any language can be learned by any kid. Same thing with this argument. You might have heard that, well, that language is just not logical enough, so people are switching to a more logical language, or that language isn't beautiful enough, and people are choosing a prettier language. Again, this isn't really a thing that is real if you look at it like a linguist. Every language has its own logics, every language has its own ways of organizing information, and objectively, no language is more beautiful than another one. That is just something that people feel. It's an aesthetic preference, right? And this last one, I hope that this is not something that y'all hear often, but there are people who will say terrible things like, that language is too primitive to continue being spoken, or that language is not fit for the modern world, right? If you hear things like this, just stop and know that this is racist, prejudiced nonsense. All languages are fit for the modern world because they are being spoken right now in the modern world, right? And every single language changes over time. Every language adapts to the way the world changes. Every language has to borrow new words for things like coffee or email or spaceship. That happens in every single language. So there's no such thing as a language that is primitive or unfit for the modern world. It doesn't exist. And basically, all of this comes down to language endangerment has nothing to do with language in itself. So why is it something linguists study? What does it actually come from? What does language endangerment stem from? Well, I think most of you have probably already figured this out. It has to do with systemic issues that affect the people who use a language. Language endangerment is fundamentally a social issue, a political issue. It's a human issue. So let's unpack a few of these kinds of systemic problems that language endangerment results from. And I don't know who is annotating the slides with a bunch of drawings and check marks. I hope it's helping your learning, but it's making it a little difficult to see. So if you can remove those, awesome. If not, don't worry about it. So one of the major and probably best discussed causes of language endangerment are what some people have called physical factors, but it goes much bigger than that, right? It's not really physical. It's a category of bad things happening to people and bad things being done by other people. And so in this big category, we might lump major kinds of injustice and terrible, terrible crimes like genocide, colonialism, war, forced cultural disruption or forced assimilation, right? Horrible things that humans do to each other. But you might also consider things like disease, right? If there's a terrible outbreak of a disease, or if there is a natural disaster, there are some known cases where a language was silenced because a natural disaster killed everyone who spoke that language, right? So this category, I like to call it the really bad stuff. This is where really, really bad things are happening directly to the people who use a language. But another really, really common cause of language endangerment could be described as economic. So this may sound familiar to some people. In a lot of cases, when people from a community have to move to a city, for example, to earn a living, maybe it's because their traditional livelihoods can't be practiced anymore. Maybe climate change or a natural disaster or conflict has made it so they can no longer make a living the way they traditionally have. This could also be described as forced integration into cash economies, which is a complicated way of saying maybe it's no longer possible, maybe it has been made impossible for people to grow their own food, for people to make their own medicine, for people to hold their own schooling, right? And so if you're being forced to integrate into a cash economy, which means you have to earn money in a way that the national currency recognizes, that often causes language endangerment because you might have to do business in a dominant language. You might have to get a job in a workplace that only uses the dominant language, lots of other economic factors. And if you've experienced this in your community, well, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. But this all again comes down to the need for people to have a stable, safe, survivable life. Another of these big categories could be called political and legal factors. So this can be anything as overt as a language actually being illegal to use, right? There are places in the world where it is against the law to use specific languages. It could be less obvious. It could be unfavorable policies, right? That penalize a school if they don't use the dominant language, that take away funding from activities in certain languages. There could be stigmatization, right? There could be a political climate that is really hostile to people who use a specific language. There could just be really bad funding available or other violations of language rights. Um, this is true in so many contexts. Either the government is unhelpful or really hostile to some languages. And finally, all these other factors often affect the way people feel and think about their languages and what they choose to do with their languages, right? You could call these sociolinguistic factors or attitude factors. These are really more symptoms of other large things happening in a community, but you often see things like changing linguistic repertoires, which is a complicated way of saying people start using different languages when previously they were multilingual in a set of languages. You might see changes in whether or not people teach a language to their kids. You might see a lot of complicated stuff around shame or pride around certain languages, things where people feel their identity is more rural or less cool if they speak a certain language. And there's almost always something in this general sphere of stuff happening in a language endangerment situation. And I think it's really important to note that all of these factors are interrelated. None of them exist just on their own, right? The things that fundamentally cause language endangerment are really closely linked. Colonialism is linked to economic pressure, is linked to shame, is linked to political repression. All these things tie together. And so most endangered language communities are facing more than one of these issues. Oftentimes, they're facing all of these issues at the same time. And for that reason, I just want to say that it's really important to remember not to blame language communities for language endangerment. Luckily, I see this happening a lot less every year that goes by as people learn more about language endangerment. But you do sometimes still hear arguments that people are choosing to shift to another language, or that, well, they've opted to learn English instead. But those arguments are not fully sincere and not fully informed, in my opinion, because in the best case, even in the cases where it seems most voluntary that people are shifting languages, it's usually because they don't have very good choices available around what languages to use and to transmit. And so, if you're being forced to choose between keeping your language, keeping your cultural identity, and making enough money to give your family a good life, or even to stay alive and stay out of prison, that's not really a choice, is it? It's not a free choice in the way we might understand it. And so, I just want to say at the end of the day, it's important not to blame communities who are experiencing language loss. It's not anything they have really, truly, freely chosen in almost any case. But again, this is really a complicated topic, and I welcome all of y'all to discuss it respectfully in the chat and with everyone else. And the baseline is language endangerment doesn't happen when things are okay. And I'd like to quote a really beautiful and succinct definition and discussion of this by Chickasaw scholar Jenny L. Davis. Language endangerment is tied to the decline or demise of indigenous sovereignty or autonomy, the loss of political, economic, or geographic stability and power, or even the strong correspondence of language attrition, that is, language loss, language endangerment, with the actual necropolitical dynamics in marginalized communities. And necropolitical dynamics means these sort of systemic ways that life and death happen differently for different communities, right? Certain kinds of privilege actually make you live longer. Certain kinds of marginalization bring death upon you is the easiest way to explain necropolitics. And so again, this is not something abstract. This is not something harmless. Language loss has everything to do with real concrete harms to people and communities. So sometimes people ask, okay, is language endangerment just a yes or no question, right? Is a language either endangered or not endangered? And the answer is not really. It's more like a scale. Well, really, it's not as simple as a scale, but a lot of scholars try to visualize it like a scale, right? And so, one way to imagine it, and this is based on the Language Endangerment Index, which is used by ELP, is sort of like a spectrum from a small risk. There is some risk here to things have already gotten really serious for this language community. So for example, Sasak is a language in Indonesia that has probably 2 million speakers, but things are changing. Kids are not learning or using the language as often. And so there is some risk there of endangerment. And in the middle, what we might call threatened is a language called Iasa, the language I have mostly done documentation work with. There are still about 2,000 people who speak Iasa on a daily basis, but that's not a huge population, and kids aren't learning the language or using it regularly. And then again, this is a label a lot of communities don't appreciate for very good reasons. In this sphere that might be called critically endangered, this is when you may only have a small number of fluent speakers still living. And a lot of the time they are elders. And so time is really critical in those cases. So for example, Tunica, which is spoken up in Canada in the province of British Columbia, has about 18 fluent speakers today. However, I do want to say that even when a language comes to this place called dormant, which means sleeping, right? A sleeping language is one that doesn't currently have any living fluent speakers. And there are many, many currently dormant languages all around the world. But that is not a hopeless place to be. And I want to really emphasize this. This is not a scale that only goes in one direction, right? Things can get better for language communities through hard work and dedication. Things can move back away from that place of dormancy. Even if a language has lost all of its fluent speakers, there's still the possibility that it can wake up, right? Dormant just means sleeping. a language can wake up from that state if people begin speaking it again. And there are many examples of awakening languages all around the world too. And I'll include these slides so you can learn more about each of these languages and the communities that speak them. And again, this is a messy, messy thing. This is a social and political issue that doesn't really lend itself to just putting it on a scale or on a rating or a set of numbers. It's a lot more complicated than that. So we use these scales as sort of a shorthand to talk about, where in a general sense a language context is. And I'll share some readings about this notion of using numbers or quantifying language endangerment in the Google Drive. And so I don't think I actually have to say this in 2024, right? Every passing year, people understand more and more that Indigenous, endangered, and minoritized languages are really, really important. This isn't just sort of an abstract question of like, oh, what a shame if we lose some languages. No, this matters in a real way to real people. And I would love to hear from each of you why that is true for you and your community. Why does your language matter to you? And it may be impossible to put that into words. It probably is. But why do languages matter to the people around you, right? Why do languages matter to your family, to people in your community, to people in your country? And when we think about that, that sort of helps us explore, okay, well, which parts of my language do I want to start working on, right? Which parts matter to me and which parts do I want to safeguard for the future? And I don't know if I should go through all this because there are so many reasons that languages matter to people, but some of the big categories we often hear about are your cultural, spiritual, and social identity. Language in a very real way is who we are. There's a lot of research showing that languages have a lot to do with our health and well-being, our physical health, right? The health of our bodies, our mental health, how we experience the world, our social health, how we interact with the people around us, our spiritual health, the ways we feel connected to the outside of the human and material world, right? Language has everything to do with that as well. Language rights are human rights. If you are unfamiliar with this concept, if you say, what? People have a right to language? I encourage you to look up the Global Coalition for Language Rights. They have a really interesting and clear declaration of language rights. And the UN agrees that Indigenous peoples have the right to use and transmit their languages. This is a widely codified UN declaration. And also, there's so much knowledge held in language. It goes so far beyond just sort of medical and historical and ecological knowledge. There are also entire ways of understanding the world that are contained within languages. And this is really crucial if, like me, you're a linguist and you want to understand how humans do language. It would be really hard to do that without knowing anything about all of the languages in the world that may be facing endangerment. And of course, literature, poetry, music, all of that stuff is so closely tied up in language. I think a lot of us can understand the feeling that our favorite song would not be the same thing in another language. Our favorite poem would not mean the same thing in another language. And so much more. So I'd love to hear from y'all which parts of language really resonate with you and feel most important to you. And again, in recognition of this, the United Nations has declared that we are in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. It runs from 2022 to 2032, so we are now in the third year. This is an entire decade for the international community to take action to protect and defend and revitalize Indigenous languages. So again, this is a pretty rough time for language diversity. There is more language endangerment now than there ever has been in human history, as far as we know. But it's also a great time for languages because more and more communities around the world are working to reclaim, revitalize, and document their languages. People are taking action to address this problem. And so you might be asking, how do I get involved? How do I help address this problem? And that is why we are here today. We are here to learn about one of the things that anyone can contribute to reacting, to responding, to resisting language endangerment. And so we're here to talk about language documentation, which in the terms it was defined as in this 2006 paper that sort of started the field of language documentation formally, it is described as creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. What does that actually mean? What is a lasting multi-purpose record? Well, I want to first say I'm going to be talking about language documentation from a Western academic perspective because that's who I am, that's how I'm trained, that's where I come from. But, like I said, language documentation is not something you need to be a Western academic to do. It is not a field just for academics or scholars. There are a lot of ways to do language documentation and a lot of ways to understand the purpose and the methods of language documentation. And so I want to say what I'm going to share here is just one way to do it. And I want you all to think about how it would make sense to do language documentation in your community, in your context, grounded in what language means to you and what language means to your community. There's no single right path. Any way that you are able to gather your language and keep it safe for the future is a great way to do language documentation. So everything from here on out is just how I've been trained. Take it with a grain of salt. So language documentation, we said it's a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. And this generally involves making recordings of lots of different parts of the language, different aspects of the language, and how it's actually used. And this includes not just focusing on one language by itself, right? If you're from a very multilingual community, it's great to include other languages used by the people in your community. Ideally, when we're doing language documentation, we'd use professional or at least good quality recording equipment. And this is not always possible, right? Not everyone has a professional audio recorder sitting around. But a goal is to get the best quality sound and image you can. And then we often also keep language data in an archive or a museum if you choose, if there's an archive or museum that you feel comfortable working with. But really the goal is just to keep that language information somewhere it can be kept safe for a really long time so that people for future generations can access it. And finally, optionally, language documentation can involve studying the language and how it's used, right? Not even necessarily in academic ways, but just learning more deeply about how your language works. And I'm just going to check the chat for questions real quick. Yes, of course, if it's really late where you are, feel free to watch the recording later and just check the slides. You should definitely feel free to go to bed if it is 4 a.m. where you are. All right. And so when people start thinking about language documentation, they often ask, well, what should I document? A whole language is a lot to document, right? And so some good starting places are you might start with lists of words or sentences and what they mean in another language. You might record conversations, people giving a speech, other important kinds of speech acts, as linguists call it, which just means any way that people use language that is really culturally significant or has a lot of meaning to you. But really, it can also be everyday language. It doesn't have to be anything important or formal, right? So a story about, oh, the time I got a flat tire on the road coming back from this party, or a song, a proverb, a recipe, instructions for how to do stuff, jokes, anything and everything about how people use your language is a really valuable thing to document. Nothing is too normal, too ordinary, or too fancy to be part of language documentation. But in general terms, if you think about sort of structured language documentation, A lot of times people try to make records of a few key things. Number one, phonology, as linguists put it, which just means the sounds used in a language, if it's a spoken language, or the hand shapes used in a sign language. The words, right? This is a good starting place. The words, as many as you can gather. This is called the lexicon. You also might want to make records of how words are formed, right? And how they get turned into other words. So if I were documenting English, I'd be like, what is the difference between eat and ate? And how do we get that from eat to eaten? And that's called morphology, right? The way that words get built. You could also look at how words are put together to make sentences. And this, generally speaking, is called syntax. And then finally, how do we put sentences together to make conversations and stories and speeches and jokes? And this is generally covered under fields like discourse analysis. And also really important, examples of people actually using the language, whether this is conversations or speeches or stories or whatever. And traditionally in language documentation, these are called texts, which is a little strange because they're often spoken instead of written, but we call them texts. And then beyond just those basic categories, you can also have really specialized topics in language documentation. And it's getting really dark in here, so I'm gonna turn on a light. Hopefully you can still see me okay. Uh, and you could have an interest in a really specialized topic that could be a wonderful documentation project. So some actual examples of documentation I've seen, studies of special vocabulary that you use while you're hunting, differences in how different groups of people pronounce things, how children learn to put plurals on nouns, who speaks which languages to who, maybe across different generations or different villages. How do you make up song melodies in tone languages? How do you fit those tones into song melodies? And then what I find really interesting is sometimes there are cultural protocols about not saying the names of your in-laws or words that sound like your in-laws' names. And so people have to find strategies to use different words that don't sound like their father-in-law's name, for example. And these are just a handful of examples. There are almost infinite topics you could study in language documentation projects. And so you might be getting a little intimidated at this point. You might say, oh my gosh, so I can document anything? I can document everything? What do I do? So that's okay. Take a breath. Language documentation can cover a really wide range, and ideally, we'd record everything. That would be the perfect documentation project, is record every way that a language can be used. But that's not realistic. We're just humans. We have limited time and resources. So if you're asking yourself, how should I best document my language? Where should I start? Well, it's always good to think about what you're trying to accomplish in your documentation work. And that covers things like the audience that this documentation is for, and what you want people to do with what you record. So first off, if you think about who are you making this documentation for? Ideally, you could make the documentation that's useful to everyone, but realistically, it helps to narrow it down. So think about maybe potential language learners could use this material you're gathering. This could be people who don't already speak the language and are trying to learn it. Or maybe it's for people in your community who do already know the language, or the descendants they'll have in the future who do know the language. Are you making this documentation maybe for an academic study? Like, are you doing linguistics? Are you doing anthropology? Are you doing sociology? Or maybe you're in a totally different kind of field. Are you a biologist who wants to know what words people use in certain farming practices? Or are you making this for knowledge keepers in the future who are looking at the ways people interact with the land around them? Who else, right? There are lots of people who could use the language materials you gather now. So think about who your main audience is. And you might also want to think about what you want to happen as a result of this documentation. What is your highest priority here? Are you hoping to make a learner's guide or a grammar of your language? Do you want to make maybe classroom materials for learners to study or practice with? Do you want to have recordings to give to the family members or descendants of the people you are recording? Do you want to make a dictionary? That's a pretty common desire. Or maybe you want to structure your documentation around a specific kind of language or a specific topic. Like, do you want to put together a book of stories? Do you want to make a recipe book? Do you want to make a music album? Whatever you want to do. Or is your goal really just to have sort of a safety net of records in an archive for any future uses that might come up later? Or do you want to just make cool stuff on YouTube or social media? That's also a very legitimate outcome. There's a lot you could do. There's so much you could do. And all of these are great places to start. You could spend a lifetime doing all of this. So think about which ones fit your skills and interests the best and start there. And one thing sometimes you hear that language documentation is just about gathering a bunch of recordings and putting them in a drawer and then leaving them there forever. No, that's not really what documentation is about, right? Documentation creates recordings, but it doesn't stop there. Um, Linguists might phrase this as documentation is about the relationships between language materials and their annotation. But what that means in clearer terms is that documentation is about creating these language materials and then learning something from them or doing something with them. And so don't just leave your recordings sitting in a desk and forget about them. They need to go out there into the world if they can and help people's goals for their language. So some of the common things that people do with language documentation are dictionaries, grammars, learner's guides. A lot of people make lexical databases. So for example, an Excel spreadsheet of 7,000 words in your language. What an incredible outcome. And then when you get a little more technical, you can also create transcribed and annotated materials, like in the softwares Elan or Flex. And this is where you get to do a little more deep analysis of the language materials you've gathered. You could also, if you're a scholar, you could create academic publications and so on. And if you're on the computer science side of things, this could also be the starting point for language corpora or large collections of structured language information. And so now we are in this AI era. This might also be where you start thinking about training a large language model. That is not my field. I don't know anything about that, but people are doing it. Uh, but these aren't the only options. These are just a few things you could do with your documentation materials. So get creative. If you have an idea for what you could do with your materials, try it out. But one really important note, I know I've been talking about getting your materials out there into the world, gathering as much as you possibly can, but it's also about the experience and the process of documenting your language. It's not just about what you make or what you do, it's about the activity of documentation, because through this process, you can really honor and elevate and respect the knowledge and expertise of language speakers and language keepers. By spending this time to learn from them and to gather language materials, you're demonstrating respect for what they know. It can also increase the prestige and the visibility of the language if you want more people in your country or your region to be aware that your language exists and it's out there. This is a great way to do it. And really importantly, working within your community can help create or strengthen relationships, right? You spend a lot of time with somebody working together on language documentation. It tends to create a bond. And working together on documentation can be a really powerful way to build friendships, to get to know other folks in your community, and just to create a lot of good, strong relationships. Plus, you get to learn really interesting things about your own language and culture and identity and the relationships you have with those things. But it's at the end of the day, just be careful to give attention to how you do this work, right? Do it in a good way. Do it in a way that respects the people you're working with. And on that note, It's really important to say, we don't document things that aren't okay to document, right? That seems obvious, but it bears repeating again and again. When I say record as much as you can, document everything you possibly can, there's a big exception there. You don't document things that people do not want to publish. Don't record knowledge that is not okay to share widely. Don't share language recordings unless you've gotten permission from the people you recorded to share those recordings. It takes a long time if you're working in a community that's not your own, it takes a long time to understand the protocols and the ethical requirements around what you do with these recordings and how you record them. So if you're working in your own community, also just pay attention to what people want you to share, what people want you to record. Ask what people want you to do with the recordings you make, right? Be as clear and specific as possible. You might say, I really love that story you just told. Is it okay if I share it with my mom in a WhatsApp message? I really love that song. Is it okay if I put it on YouTube, right? Just be really explicit and clear and always honor the preferences of the people that you are recording and the general protocols in your community. And here are a bunch of readings that are just a start in some ethical concepts in language documentation. All right, and so as we come to the end, you might be saying, you didn't say anything about language revitalization. And you're right, I didn't say much about language revitalization because it's sort of a different activity that's a little bit outside the scope of this session. And we won't talk about it a lot in this webinar, but we'll talk about it a little in the final weeks. And it's also important to note that documentation and revitalization aren't separate. Documentation is often a step towards revitalization, is often a component of revitalization, and it can also serve as kind of a safety net, right? If, for example, your language community is in a really, really critical spot where maybe you just have a few elders who still use the language, uh, having good documentation can be a kind of safety net if, God forbid, someday no one living is a strong speaker of your language. You'll have these records so that people can learn and reclaim and awaken your language. And I guess sort of a handy dividing line between documentation and revitalization is that documentation is making records of a language, and revitalization is about creating use and users of a language. And again, these two can really feed each other. So documentation can be really, really helpful in the process of revitalization. And one last thing, documentation isn't only for endangered languages, right? Even if your language is really strong, people speak it every day, kids are learning it, they're doing school in your language, it might still need some additional documentation. If your language isn't English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, or Korean, it's not one of the most documented languages in the world, right? And again, this is changing. There's better and better resources out there for more and more languages, but there could always be more, right? You can always do more to create media or movies or podcasts or Facebook interfaces or Wikipedia articles or theater festivals or coffee meetups, whatever. There is more you could be doing to create good records of your language if you want to. And so at the end of the day, I think documentation is a wonderful thing because basically anyone can play a part in doing it and it can be a great service to your community and your language. So let's go. Let's get started doing some language documentation. Over the next 9 weeks, we'll all be getting together to learn about different topics in this work and getting you all started in your documentation path. And so now, whew, I've talked a bunch. Let's take a breath and ask some questions. So I'm going to scroll through the chat. And if anybody would like to turn on your mic or your camera and ask a question, go ahead. Yeah, Kianush.
Hello, is my voice clear?
Yeah.
Hello? Hi. First, I really appreciate it for the very interesting talk. I've got a question regarding that measurement. You mentioned about the endangerment degree of the languages, that I think it was 4 stages. I was wondering why didn't you use that UNESCO stated, like crucially endangered, critically endangered, and is there any differences between this scale and that one, and just that?
Thanks. That is a great and very perceptive question. So yes, there is a difference between the Language Endangerment Index and the UNESCO 9 stages scale. And I don't want to get too deep into it because it's a little nerdy and technical, but the Catalog of Endangered Languages team developed the Language Endangerment Index so that essentially different factors in language endangerment could be looked at independently, right? The UNESCO scale kind of groups together certain factors. So it groups together literacy with number of speakers, with degree of intergenerational transmission, and puts those all on a single continuum. Whereas the Language Endangerment Index rates each of those things independently and then combines them into sort of an overall endangerment level. And so it's a little bit more flexible with contexts that maybe don't fit that UNESCO scale perfectly. And I'm happy to share a paper explaining kind of the rationale behind the LEI. I'll put that in the Google Drive folder too.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. And I will just kind of read through the chat because I think I missed some questions. I see a note that says people say here you have to learn English because that's the only language that will give you a good job. Do not learn indigenous languages. They are useless. Oh, I hate to hear that. I'm sorry. And that's what I call the false economic factor, says Jorge Andres. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, right? This false idea that if you use your indigenous language, if you learn your indigenous language, you will somehow be at an economic disadvantage. There are a lot of problems with that idea. Number one, it assumes that no one is multilingual, right? Which is clearly quite false. Most people are bilingual or multilingual in this world. And there's no reason at all that someone shouldn't know and use a dominant language or a colonial language, as well as their indigenous language if they want to access the economic benefits of the dominant language. That's completely possible and should not be something that causes language endangerment, but it often does. I also see a note that conflict, yeah, violent and political conflict is also one of the reasons a language can be endangered because it displaces the population. Absolutely. This is a really common cause of language endangerment around the world. Displacement and migration can be really, really tough for language vitality, much less the human suffering that goes with it. Yeah. Let's see. Is there any place to store recorded items for a longer time? Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it depends on what you mean by longer. Archives, theoretically, are supposed to keep items safe for hundreds and hundreds of years. They are required to have a long-term storage plan that includes things like having extra copies of all the materials in case the archive building catches fire, and having regular plans to update the technology that all of the information is kept in, right? If an archive just kept like a wax cylinder for 200 years, nobody would have a machine that could play a wax cylinder. And so archives have agreed to regularly change and update the formats that they store their materials in. So theoretically, yeah, an archive is where a longer time storage is supposed to happen. Um, but if you were asking for a much longer time, there is a project called the Rosetta Disk that actually engraved some phrases in a bunch of languages on a piece of stone embedded in some kind of extra hard glass and sent it into space, and it will last thousands of years. Let's see. There, see a question. May I ask what specific output shall we submit after the training? That's a great question, Daisy. So this is not a traditional course in that you won't have homework, right? You don't have to do anything to get a grade. This is really just a learning opportunity. However, if you want to start working on a documentation project and talk about it with other people in this group, that is very much encouraged. I will send a link to the Facebook group right here. And if you don't use Facebook, that is also totally okay. We are thinking about having an email list, but I'll send around a form to everybody who's signed up today for you to opt in to a group email list if you would like. I'm not going to share your email with anyone else without your permission. All right, I see a comment. Hi, I'm from the Philippines and currently working on my own language. I'm doing a linguistic analysis of Maguindanao. I'm so sorry if I got that wrong. Awesome, welcome. I'm so happy to see people who are here working on their languages. I see another comment. I want to highlight the importance of language documentation, which is not merely a technical process, but a vital step in preserving the cultural identity and wisdom embedded in the lives of a community. Absolutely. Yeah, our efforts today are not just for the present, but for future generations who will benefit from the knowledge carried by every word. Absolutely, beautifully said. This is really work for the long term. This is work that people do out of love for future generations in the hope that they can get to their languages and everything carried in them. Yeah, beautiful. Let's see, I see a question. May I know where and how we can access the full lecture and open forum? Yes, absolutely. I will send an email to everybody registered for this webinar with the links to the recording, the Google Drive where the materials are, and the Facebook group where y'all can talk to each other. Let's see. Are college archives safe and ethical, and or can we create our own in my community? Superb question. Yeah. Safe and ethical is a question that really kind of depends on the archive, and especially on the parameters for ethical, right? There is a long history of quite unethical behavior by linguists, by anthropologists, by archivists who have taken language and cultural materials from communities, not returned them, used them to advance their own careers, misused them, right? Tons of bad history. And so there are still archives out there who are not operating under the most ethical protocols. There are, however, archives that not only have changed the way they do things, have grown and improved their ethical relationships with the communities whose materials they hold, but even better, there are a lot of communities who have started their own archives so that language materials and culture materials can be kept under their own protocols with their own access guidelines and in the control of the community themselves. And so if you're wondering about starting an archive in your community, I will make a note to send out a couple of resources about archive creation because it is possible to do. It takes some time and money and resources, but it absolutely is possible. All right. I see a question. Would you be going through the different software programs that can be used when documenting a language? Yes, so later in this course, we will be talking briefly about one called Elan, which is really commonly used by linguists and some other types of academics, but is a handy way to make annotations on language recordings. There are also a lot of softwares like Flex or We Say for creating dictionaries. And I will send out the slides which mention a lot of those programs and have links to where you can find them. If you're really interested in training in one of those specific softwares, let me know. I think we'd be happy to put together sort of an extra session going through how to use one or more of those softwares. Oh boy, here's a big question. Do you have any advice for someone just getting started in the field of language documentation? Oh, what a big question. Um, I think first I would quote a Nigerian linguist named Bolanle Arakoyo, who said, "This is something for the long term. You have to be really dedicated," she said, because it's not something anyone can do for a year and then just leave, right? It's something that really requires slow, careful, long-term building of relationships within the community you're working with. And it takes a lot of time to do good language documentation, right? Just I've known linguists who have spent 60 years working on one dictionary and they still feel like it's nowhere close to done. So the first one is go slow and be patient is my first piece of advice. And I guess the second one is prioritize the relationships you have and what the community you're working with really wants you to be doing, what you can do to further their goals and aspirations for their language. And those are both pieces of advice that are tough to implement. They take a lot of work, they take a lot of thought, and they take a lot of care. But I think those are the two most important ones. I could give you technical advice, I could suggest softwares and recorders, but none of that would be nearly as important as really take care in how you do this in such a way that you're improving the lives of the people you work with and you're leaving the world better off in some way. It's a big piece of advice. Sorry. I'm happy to talk more if anyone has questions if about exactly where you are in your documentation journey. Let's see. So I see another comment. People from my community and me are speakers of a dormant language that nowadays is critically endangered. We use the documentation created 200 years ago. Amazing. We have a little child who started speaking the language. I now know that dormant is the name. We used to say dead language. Oh, that is beautiful to hear. Yeah, because that child who is now speaking the language is proof that the language wasn't dead. It was sleeping, and now it's waking up with that kid. And I'm so happy to hear that. Congratulations. Let's see. Please, can we have a little practical session to learn how to annotate recorded data? Great question. All right, that is our first request for an annotation training. So I will make a note that we'll offer sort of an extra little training in Elan for anyone who's interested in those kind of technical skills. Is there an app that can help in glossing sentences? Yeah, there are several. So Elan is one of those that's really useful for annotating, including glossing recordings. Some simpler ones include We Say or shoot, what's the other one? But there's one I'm forgetting, but another one called First Voices is also very useful for that purpose. So I'll send out a list of these sort of tools. And I see another question. I'm a PhD student from Pakistan, currently at University of Sydney. I want to ask if an increase in the number of speakers for a certain Indigenous language guarantees its survival, especially when there's visible language loss from an intergenerational transmission perspective. Yeah, what a great question and a complicated one. Unfortunately, there's nothing that guarantees the survival of any given language. Similarly, there's nothing that guarantees doom for any given language. I think the thing that really counts is what the people within that community do in response to the outside forces that are causing language endangerment. And so, an increased number of speakers is a sign that people within that community are doing something powerful in response to language endangerment. So while I can't say it guarantees its survival, especially if there's a problem in intergenerational transmission, if kids aren't learning the language, I can say it's a sign that something's going really right if that number of speakers is growing, that something the community is doing is working. And so even if there still is a challenge around intergenerational transmission, whatever that community is doing can probably be extended to kids who might grow up in the language later on. So, yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any more specific questions about that context. I see one more comment. It could be great if the ELP team could create a video going through Elan. How nice that you say that. In fact, in a past year of webinars, we have a training video for Elan. So I will also send out the link to that recording from last year. And I hope there will be a training on metadata. Okay, noted. I will note that there is some interest in that. Metadata is a very broad topic, so if you'd like to learn anything more specific, feel free to reach out, and we will find you some resources that are more tailored. Uh, I would also like to say to everyone here that there's a wonderful resource at ELP in the form of the Language Revitalization Mentors. So these are folks at ELP who Their role is to just be there to talk with anyone who wants to engage in language documentation or revitalization. And these are free appointments you can make over Zoom. There are 4 mentors who, between them, they can work with you in 11 different languages. So they're all wonderful folks. They're all really experienced in language revitalization and documentation. And so please feel free to reach out to them anytime and make an appointment. They would love to talk with you. I just put the URL in the chat. Just go to endangeredlanguages.com/mentors and make a free appointment. We would love to talk with you. And let's see, one more question. Languages are going towards endangerment rapidly due to socioeconomic reasons. Is documentation enough to save them? Ah, what a good question. The answer is no. Documentation doesn't really address the root causes of language endangerment, right? Documentation is sort of a safety measure, a support for the broader process of language revitalization, right? Let's say people are no longer using the language because they've been forced to move away from their traditional lands because of armed conflict, right? Documentation, creating good records of that language isn't going to address the problem that people have been displaced from their land, that they're probably suffering economically, they're probably suffering physically. There's a lot more going on that's causing that change in the use of the language. And really, what needs to happen there is changes to that broader context that people are living in. And so that doesn't really happen through documentation, but documentation can be a support for that work to change the broader context of a language. I hope that makes sense. Documentation is still a valuable and important thing to do, but it's just a small piece of this broader work to strengthen languages. All right, I see a request to include hands-on training to create a multilingual dictionary too. All right. And I would also like to give a shout out to our friends at 7,000 Languages who offer a platform. The 7,000 Languages course creation platform is a great way to create learning materials for your language for free. No one ever has to pay to make a language course at 7,000 Languages. And I would also like to nod to our friends at the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, who have a program called the Living Dictionaries app. I'm going to just try to put the link here in the chat off the top of my head. I think that's the actual link. Please let me know if it doesn't work. But the Living Dictionaries app is a great way to create a multilingual talking dictionary online. It is also free. And both 7,000 Languages and Living Tongues frequently have free training sessions in how to create these resources. So definitely check them out and attend one of these excellent trainings by Living Tongues and 7,000 Languages. Yeah, and I see a comment. I wish we could work to develop an encyclopedia of the local language. Yeah, that's a really beautiful idea, right? An encyclopedia encompasses so much more than what a dictionary might. It lets you go a lot deeper than just the words or the grammar and bring in all of the other kinds of knowledge that are linked to language. That's a great idea. Whew, and I think we somehow got through all of the many questions in the chat. So I want to thank all of you for your insightful and excellent questions. It was really a pleasure to talk with y'all today. And so I know we're a little bit over time, so thanks everyone for sticking around to the end as well. I want to let you know that next week we will be learning about making audio and video recordings, a good first step in documentation. How do we actually make these recordings? And so Jillian from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, from the Language Documentation Training Center, will be leading a session on how to make good audio and video recordings even if you're having to do it remotely, right? You can do this over Zoom, you can do this over WhatsApp. So next week, we'll learn about how to do that. So I hope to see everyone next week at this same time, at this same Zoom link. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to send me an email, and I will put my email address in the chat, Anna@endangeredlanguages.com. So I wish all of you a beautiful evening, morning, afternoon, whatever it is where you are. Take care, and we can't wait to see you next week. Thanks, everyone.